They always do when they realize what real medicine looks like. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 hours before everything changed. Seattle General in Atlanta hums with the low frequency of fluorescent lights and the chemical smell of antiseptic that never quite masks something underneath, something that smells like copper and regret. The ER shifts through its morning routine like a machine, well-oiled and indifferent. Rachel Torres moves through it like water, unnoticed, her scrubs fitting someone else's life perfectly while she inhabits a different one entirely. Her movements are economical. Precise. A slight limp in her left leg barely visible unless you were trained to see it, and most people aren't trained to see much of anything. The new temp nurse. That's all she is to them. She arrives at 0600 hours, 6 in the morning to people who speak in normal time. The parking lot is still dark, the kind of dark that comes before the city wakes, and Rachel sits in her car for 4 minutes with the engine running and her forehead against the steering wheel. Her hands are steady. They're always steady. In the rearview mirror, her eyes are the color of burnished steel, the kind of eyes that have seen things that change the architecture of a person's soul. But in the ER, those eyes stay down. Deferential. Unthreatening. Just a nurse looking for a paycheck and nothing more. She's been nobody for 18 months. The locker in the staff room is the size of a coffin standing on end, and Rachel fills it with the careful precision of someone who has learned that arrangement matters. Her scrubs go on the left hook. Her personal items go on the shelf above, a single photograph in a manila envelope, face down, and beneath it, a plastic evidence bag containing a pair of worn combat boots. The leather is scarred. The laces are frayed. The toe box carries stains that will never come out because some things don't wash away, not with water, not with time, not with anything this world has to offer. She stares at those boots for 6 seconds. Then she closes the locker and heads to the supply inventory. The trauma kits need restocking. Rachel moves through the ER supply closet like she's done this 10,000 times, which she has, though not in a civilian hospital. The bandages are color-coded by size. The airway equipment sits in labeled drawers, endotracheal tubes in graduated sizes, laryngoscope blades, emergency surgical supplies. Her hands arrange everything with the muscle memory of someone who learned this when seconds meant the difference between a soldier breathing and a soldier bleeding out in the sand. She folds the trauma dressings into exact thirds. She counts the 18-gauge needles by touch. The work is meditation. The work is silence. The work is the only thing that feels like truth anymore. A nurse named Patricia walks past, 43 years old, wedding ring worn down to brass underneath the gold plating, tired eyes that gave up on hope sometime around 2015. Rough first shift, she asks, and Rachel shakes her head without looking up. No, Quiet. Patricia nods and moves on, which is correct. Nobody wants to know the story. Nobody ever does. Morning rounds begin at 0700. Dr. Whitfield moves through the ER like a man who owns it, which, in his way, he does. He's 6'3" with the kind of posture that comes from a father's money and a boarding school education at a place with a Latin name. His watch costs more than Rachel's rent, a Rolex Submariner, steel and gold, the kind of timepiece that announces accomplishment to everyone in the room who cares about such things. He enters the ER with an entourage of residents and 2 medical students trailing behind him like pilot fish following a shark. The fluorescent lights flicker. "Gentlemen," Whitfield says, his voice pitched to carry, "we have a new temporary staff member." He gestures vaguely toward Rachel, who is making notes in a patient chart near bed 3. She doesn't look up. "Let me share a statistical observation with you. 100% of temporary nurses in this department quit within 7 days of beginning their assignment. 100%. And I will," he pauses for effect, spreading his hands like a magician about to reveal the trick, "I will personally wager $50 that this one doesn't make it past Thursday." One of the residents laughs, a high, uncertain sound that echoes wrong in the space. Rachel's jaw clenches. Once. Barely perceptible. The kind of movement that would be invisible to someone who wasn't looking for it, and no one is looking. Her hands remain absolutely steady as she continues writing. Temperature, 98.6. Respirations, 16. Pulse, 78. The words flow from her pen like water flowing downhill, without thought, without effort, the way things move when physics has already decided the outcome. Whitfield glances at her. Waiting, maybe, for a reaction. A flinch. A widened eye. The small betrayal that novices always leak when they're being mocked in public. But Rachel's face is a closed book. Her shoulders don't tense. She turns the page of the chart and makes another note. The pen doesn't shake. He smiles, satisfied with his own cleverness, and moves to the next bed. The residents follow. The students follow. The shark moves on because the prey showed no signs of being wounded, and sharks only attack what bleeds. Rachel finishes the chart and places it in the holder at the foot of the bed. Her left leg aches where the shrapnel is still there, where it will always be there, lodged against the femoral artery in a way that keeps her on a list somewhere classified above top secret. She distributes her weight differently when she walks now. The limp comes and goes depending on the barometric pressure and whether she slept on that side. Most people don't notice. Most people aren't trained to see. The ER fills with morning light. By 0900, the rhythm of the hospital has established itself. Code blues get called. Patients arrive in ambulances with chest pain and difficulty breathing. A 72-year-old woman with a stroke alert comes through Trauma Bay 2. An 8-year-old with a fractured femur arrives with his mother holding his hand so tightly her own knuckles go white. Rachel moves between all of it with a kind of invisible competence that makes people forget you're there. She starts fours without them having to ask twice. She draws blood samples with a single clean stick while other nurses need multiple attempts. She knows where every piece of equipment lives before she's been there 48 hours. She knows the rhythm of the ER the way some people know the rhythm of their own heartbeat. And no one asks why. The break room has a coffee maker that sounds like it's dying, a mechanical wheeze with each cycle, like lungs working overtime. Rachel stands at the counter at 1,200 hours, hands wrapped around a mug that reads "The World's Okayest Nurse" in faded blue lettering, and looks out at the parking lot 6 floors below. The rain started an hour ago. Now it hammers the windows like applause, like the world is congratulating itself on something. She remembers rain like this in Fallujah. The one time it rained there, the entire city seemed to pause. 20 years old and 3 weeks into her first deployment, and she stood on the roof of the forward operating base and thought about her mother's garden in San Diego. That was before everything changed. "You settling in okay?" Patricia again, refilling her own mug, the wedding ring catching the light. "First week in a new place is rough." "I get it." "It's fine," Rachel says, and the word emerges deferential, soft, exactly what the moment requires. "Thank you for asking." She doesn't mention that she's had 18 months to settle into the experience of being dead. She doesn't mention that a first week in a new place is simple when your real life has been classified and sealed and buried under orders that came from somewhere inside the Pentagon. She doesn't mention that she could handle Dr. Whitfield and his condescension and his $50 bet with her hands tied behind her back and her eyes closed, because she has handled far worse than mockery. She has held soldiers together while they bled out. She has made decisions that determined whether a man would walk again or spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. She has carried a colonel for miles through enemy fire while coordinating air support and keeping him breathing. "Well," Patricia says, and her voice is kind, which is almost worse than cruelty, "glad to have you here." Rachel nods and turns back to the window. The ER continues its mechanical rhythm below. Ambulance lights flash. A helicopter lands on the roof, the whop-whop-whop of the rotor wash shaking the building like a giant's hand. Trauma alert. Level 1. Someone has been in an accident. Someone is fighting for their life. And somewhere in that building, in one of these rooms, a man is about to arrive who will change everything, who will tie Rachel's buried past directly to this present moment with a rope made of impossible coincidence and military hierarchy and the particular kind of fate that finds people even when they've done everything possible to disappear. But Rachel doesn't know that yet. She finishes her coffee. The mug is empty. she rinses it and places it upside down in the drying rack, and then she heads back to the ER, where room for 08 sits waiting, and where a colonel who commanded her son's unit is being transported through the parking lot on a stretcher, his vital signs failing, his internal bleeding worse than anyone yet realizes. The doors are about to burst open. The ER doors burst open at 03 for 7 hours. Military ambulance. Paramedics running. The stretcher wheeled through like it carried something precious and breakable, which it did. Rachel caught the patient's face as they rushed past, mid-50s, strong jaw, the kind of eyes that had seen command and consequence both. Delta Force training accident, the radio crackled. Blunt force trauma. Unconscious on arrival. Vitals unstable en route. She moved without thinking, muscle memory taking over, her hands reaching for the intake clipboard before her mind caught up. But then she saw the personal effects bag. Plastic. Standard issue. The content spilled across the gurney as they transferred him to the trauma bay: wallet, watch, uniform patches, and boots. Combat boots, worn at the heel from thousands of hours in Fallujah sun, the leather creased in a pattern she recognized because her son had described them exactly in his last letter home. Lieutenant Colonel James Hendricks. The man who commanded her son's unit overseas. The man whose face had appeared in military intelligence briefings she'd read in another life, another identity, when she still had a security clearance and a rank that meant something. Rachel's hand froze on the edge of the plastic bag. 2 seconds. That was all the hesitation she allowed herself. Then she continued processing intake forms with the same mechanical precision she'd used for 7 years running from her past. Dr. Whitfield arrived in room for 08 at 0356 hours, his white coat still carrying the smell of the cafeteria coffee Rachel had spilled on herself that morning. He hadn't apologized for knocking the tray from her hands. He'd smiled instead, the kind of smile that said he'd been waiting for her to flinch, to cry, to run to the bathroom with her scrubs soaked through. But she'd knelt on the tile in front of 12 witnesses and picked up every piece, the egg, the toast, the orange slice, while coffee dripped like an accusation down her legs. Then she'd changed her scrubs and returned to the floor without a word, and Dr. Whitfield had watched her go with the expression of a predator studying prey that wouldn't break. Now he ordered standard monitoring. Cardiac monitor. Oxygen. For access. Let him stabilize, Whitfield said, already turning away, already reaching for his phone. We'll reassess in 4 hours. Rachel assisted the trauma nurses with placement, her movements economical, invisible. No one noticed the way she positioned the cardiac leads with millimeter precision. No one saw her check the colonel's carotid pulse twice instead of once, feeling for the subtlety beneath the surface. Muffled. Slightly distant. Something catching in the rhythm like a stone in a river. By 0400 hours, she was alone in room for 08 doing vitals. Blood pressure dropping incrementally. Heart sounds muffled on auscultation when she should be hearing them clear and sharp. Jugular venous distension starting to thread up his neck. Beck's triad building. Pericardial effusion. The fluid was accumulating around his heart like a whisper becoming a scream, and every minute the pressure increased meant less room for the organ to pump, meant oxygen saturation declining, meant cardiac arrest arriving like an appointment already written in the schedule. She paged Dr. Whitfield in the physician's lounge at 0412 hours. Colonel Hendricks needs an urgent echocardiogram, she said quietly into the phone. I'm hearing distant heart sounds and his JVP is elevated. The pause on the other end lasted for seconds. She could hear him drinking coffee. Swallowing. Taking his time. I'll decide what my patients need, sweetheart. His voice came through like honey poured over gravel. Go check on someone in your scope of practice. The line went dead. Rachel stood in the hallway holding the phone receiver, and for exactly one breath she let herself imagine what would happen if she walked into that lounge and told him the truth, that she'd operated on 17 soldiers in Fallujah with less equipment than this hospital had in the supply closet, that she'd kept a Marine alive for 4 miles through enemy fire while coordinating air support. That his $50 bet was the smallest mockery she'd ever endured in her life. But she didn't. Instead, she returned to room 408 and rechecked vitals every 15 minutes because that was what a nurse in her position could do. That was the boundary of her invisible world. By 0600 hours, she paged cardiology directly. Dr. Chen arrived within 10 minutes, his movements precise and fast, the way doctors moved when they already knew something was wrong. He performed the echocardiogram himself at the bedside, and the screen lit up with the answer: pericardial effusion of approximately 400 milliliters, fluid compressing the right atrium, tamponade physiology building like a pressure cooker with no release valve. "We need an immediate pericardiocentesis," Chen told Whitfield, who'd appeared in the doorway like smoke. 2-hour window, maybe less. After that, we're looking at cardiogenic shock and arrest. Whitfield didn't move. "We'll schedule him for surgical intervention when cardiothoracic gets here at noon. The cath lab is booked." Chen's jaw tightened. Noon is too late. This patient needs. That's my decision to make. Whitfield's voice carried the weight of institutional authority, the certainty of someone who'd never been questioned successfully, who'd built his career on knowing exactly how much cruelty a system would tolerate. "Unless you'd like to file a formal objection with hospital administration." Doctor number 1 walked away at 0623 hours. Chen left the room, shaking his head, and Rachel watched him go down the corridor toward the elevator with the posture of a man who'd just lost an argument he'd already known was unwinnable. She continued her vitals. BP dropping another 5 points. O2 sat holding at 93 but trending downward. The colonel's breathing had shifted, shallow, rapid, the respiratory pattern of a body working harder to pull oxygen from air that was increasingly insufficient. She documented everything. Time-stamped. Precise. A paper trail that would matter later, though she didn't know that yet. At 0651 hours, another cardiologist, Dr. Patricia Haley, reviewed the chart and the echo images and immediately recommended the same thing: emergency pericardiocentesis. Whitfield refused again. "I'm the attending. The decision stands." Doctor number 2 backed down at 0652 hours. By 0700 hours, a surgeon from the thoracic team appeared, Dr. Marcus Webb, brought in by Haley, hoping a colleague with surgical authority might carry more weight. Webb looked at the echo, looked at the vitals trending downward, looked at the timeline, and said what needed saying: "This patient is going to arrest if we wait for the cath lab. I'll perform the pericardiocentesis in this room right now." "Not without my authorization," Whitfield said flatly. "And I'm not giving it." Webb's face darkened. "That's a decision that will get him killed. That's my prerogative as the attending physician." Doctor number 3. Then number 4. A pulmonologist who reviewed the case and wanted intervention. A hospitalist who consulted and recommended immediate drainage. Both walked away when they met the same institutional wall, the same smile, the same certainty that came from knowing the hospital board played golf with Dr. Whitfield on Saturday mornings. Rachel watched all of it happen across for hours. Watched competent physicians retreat. Watched the system protect itself. Watched a Delta Force colonel's oxygen saturation drop to 88% while 7 doctors either abandoned the case or refused to authorize treatment that would save his life. 7. That specific number would matter. That number would be the pivot point where everything changed. But in 0704 hours, she only knew that the room was becoming increasingly quiet except for the monitors, that the colonel's skin was taking on a grayish pallor beneath his tan, that his blood pressure had dropped below 85 systolic, and that the window was closing fast. The hiss of the ventilator. The steady beep of the cardiac monitor. The fluorescent lights humming their electric prayer above a man who'd commanded soldiers and earned medals and never expected to be killed by institutional negligence inside a hospital that was supposed to heal him. Rachel stood at the foot of his bed in her coffee-stained scrubs, the one she'd never changed because another tray would just get knocked down again, and she made a choice that would burn her cover to ash. The colonel's systolic pressure was 82 millimeters of mercury by 0900 hours. Rachel had watched the numbers slide downward through the morning rounds like a countdown on a timer nobody wanted to acknowledge, each decimal point a step closer to organ shutdown, each beep of the monitor a heartbeat negotiating with physics it couldn't win against. The internal bleeding wasn't slowing. If anything, it was accelerating behind the sternum like a quiet catastrophe nobody was loud enough to prevent. She knew what he needed. The knowledge sat in her hands like muscle memory, like something her body understood before her mind could form the words. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the pericardial sac around the heart, compressing it, suffocating it from the inside. There was only one way to buy time before he'd need the full surgical team, only one way to drain the fluid and let his heart pump again. Emergency pericardiocentesis. A needle between the ribs, guided by ultrasound or sometimes just by years of knowing exactly where to push and how much resistance means you're in the right place. Dr. Whitfield was reviewing the chart at the nursing station when Rachel approached, her voice level and professional, the voice of someone who had already decided to break every rule she'd agreed to follow by being here. His systolic is down to 82, doctor. He needs the procedure now. She presented the clinical picture like a thesis, because that was what he respected, not the tremor of concern, not the urgency that ran through her veins like adrenaline from 100 combat extractions, but data. Numbers. Evidence. Tamponade progression is accelerating. Without intervention, he'll go into cardiogenic shock within the hour. Whitfield didn't look up from the chart. The patient is stable enough for observation. He'll get cardiothoracic surgery when they have availability. His fingers tapped the clipboard like a gavel. And Master Sergeant, I thought I made myself clear about questioning my medical judgment. She didn't correct him on the rank. That would only prove she was paying attention, which was exactly what he wanted, acknowledgement that his words had weight, that they landed, that they hurt. Instead, she turned and walked to the phone. He was already 3 steps ahead of her. The call had already gone out to Dr. Morrison in the department, the chief of medicine, who reviewed the case file and said exactly what Whitfield had probably rehearsed with him on the way down the hallway. Without cardiothoracic surgery physically present, we're exposing the hospital to massive liability if something goes wrong. He's stable. We wait. That was doctor number 1, but she knew there would be more. There were always more when someone like Whitfield started working the phones. Institutional resistance moved like a chain reaction, each person citing the last person, each refusal building armor around the first refusal. Dr. Patel from Risk Management arrived at room 408 like a consultant arriving to a funeral, already mentally composing his report. He glanced at the monitors, glanced at Whitfield's chart notes, which Rachel noted had been written with exquisite carefulness, language constructed to document caution rather than clinical urgency, and folded his arms. Hospital protocol requires cardiothoracic surgery availability for any procedure involving the pericardium. We follow protocol. Full backup on site or we wait. That was doctor number 2. His voice had the quality of a man reading from a script he'd memorized years ago, a script that had never once failed to protect him because protection and medicine had become the same thing somewhere along the way. Rachel paged Dr. Kumar, the interventional cardiologist who'd admitted 3 pericardial cases in the past month alone. He came to the bedside, looked at the tracing, looked at Whitfield, and said, I can't override the attending of record. If Dr. Whitfield wants to manage conservatively, that's his call to make. Not a refusal, exactly, more like a refusal to be caught in the crossfire. Doctor number 3, walking backward away from the problem like it might detonate if he got too close. Dr. Lee from the night shift, called in because she'd actually done this procedure before, 17 times in 7 years, examined the patient and met Rachel's eyes with something like recognition. I see what's happening here, she said quietly. Her hands were steady as she withdrew from the room. But I'm not authorized to perform this without CT surgery present. Hospital bylaws. Dr. Whitfield's service has them on paper. Doctor number 4, who understood the problem perfectly and chose the rules anyway. By 10:45 hours, Rachel had called for more attending physicians. Dr. Yamamoto from the night shift came in and looked at the monitor, looked at Whitfield, looked at Rachel, and his expression shifted into something that might have been pity. My hands are tied by hospital protocol, he said, and she heard what he was really saying, I see you. I know what you know. I can't help you. I'm sorry. That was Doctor Number 5, speaking the language of professional surrender. The colonel's blood pressure hit 78 systolic. The number on the monitor seemed almost obscene in its smallness, like watching someone shrink in real time. His heart was beating faster to compensate, working harder to push blood through chambers that were being squeezed by the very fluid meant to protect them, a betrayal written in physiology. Dr. Chen returned to the room at 1100 hours, came to the bedside, looked at the monitor, and said to Whitfield with the flat certainty of someone who'd made 1,000 diagnoses before, "You're going to kill this man." There was no anger in her voice, which somehow made it worse. Just fact. Clinical observation. Medical truth stated in present tense. He needs the procedure. Now. Whitfield's jaw tightened once, a micro-expression that suggested he'd been planning his response since the moment Chen had shown up at the door. "Document that you disagree with my treatment plan and leave my patient's room," he said, each word a nail being driven. Immediately. Doctor Number 6, dismissed with the precision of someone who'd done this before, who understood that institutional power flows in one direction when you control the chart. Rachel felt it then, the moment of crystallization, the instant when the mathematics of it became unavoidable. Exactly 7 doctors had now opposed, refused, or abandoned the case. 7. The word hung in the air like a prophecy someone had whispered and she'd only just now learned to hear. She was the only person left. Whitfield turned to her with something like satisfaction in his expression, the look of a man who'd cleaned the field of obstacles. "If you question my medical decisions one more time, I'll have your agency terminate your contract today." His voice had the quality of a weapon being assembled, each component fitting into place. "Effective immediately, you're reassigned to pediatric. The charge nurse has your new assignment. You stay away from room 408. You stay away from this patient. Are we clear?" She nodded once, her hand steady at her sides, her face showing nothing because there was nothing to show anymore, no pretense left to maintain. She turned and walked toward the elevator because that was the answer he expected, the response that confirmed his power, the retreat that proved he'd won. The elevator doors slid open. The numbers climbed: 2nd floor, 3rd floor, 4th floor. The pediatric ward was 3 floors up. She could hear the ding of each level passing, the mechanical precision of the system carrying her away from where she needed to be, away from the man whose heart was still beating but wouldn't be for much longer if nothing changed. Then something shifted. Something in her chest, something in the space between her ribs where Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres had been living in a borrowed body for 18 years, became unmovable. The elevator climbed higher. The doors would open. The pediatric patients would need care, would need attention, would need her hands that had held lives together in the dust and chaos of Fallujah to hold bandages and take temperatures in the safety of a quiet hospital ward. She pressed the button for the 2nd floor. The elevator hesitated, reconsidering its trajectory, then began to descend. 1 floor. 2 floors. The doors opened on the cardiology ward, the same floor she'd just left, the same hall where room 408 waited like a question that wouldn't be unanswered by her absence. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric prayer above the empty corridor. Above the monitor she could still hear pulsing in the distance like a heartbeat negotiating with time. She stepped out of the elevator and walked directly back to room 408. The room went silent. Whitfield was still there, still writing notes on his chart with the careful penmanship of a man building his defense in real time. He looked up as she passed the threshold, and she watched his expression transform through several stages of something that looked like disbelief. Rachel didn't speak. She moved to the bedside and checked the monitor herself, her hands moving with the automatic precision that came from muscle memory running deeper than rules, deeper than cover, deeper than the 18 years of borrowed identity. The colonel's blood pressure was 76 now. His heart rate was 118. The numbers were screaming in a language only she could hear. "I told you to go to pediatric," Whitfield said, his voice different now, stripped of its easy authority, showing the chords underneath. She looked at him once, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. It sounded like someone else entirely. It sounded like someone who'd survived things that were supposed to be unsurvivable. Then document it. Rachel closed the door behind her with the soft precision of someone who had made irrevocable decisions before. The sound of the latch catching felt like a statement. Room for 08 held only the Colonel now, and the machines keeping him tethered to the living. She didn't look back through the window. There was nothing to see back there anymore, no permission, no protocol, no safety net. Only the Colonel's monitor, which told her everything she needed to know. The systolic pressure read 74. Dropping. The numbers descended like a countdown, 72, 71, 69. Shock was approaching with the inevitability of tide. Irreversible shock came at around 60, and after that, even perfect technique couldn't bring someone back. She had perhaps 10 minutes before the Colonel's body simply shut down, before his organs began their cascade of failure, before everything she could do became functionally meaningless. Rachel moved to the crash cart, her hands already knowing the geometry of this particular disaster. Pericardiocentesis. A needle, properly placed, into the sac surrounding his heart. 15 years ago, she had done this in Fallujah under incoming fire, with rounds punching through the concrete walls of a forward aid station, with a 19-year-old Lance Corporal's sternum cracking beneath her palms. She had done this 19 times. She could do this with her eyes closed. She would not need her eyes closed. The kit came together in her hands like muscle memory made manifest. 18-gauge needle attached to a 30-milliliter syringe. She opened the sterile field, prepped the skin at the subxiphoid approach, the safest angle, the one that skirted the pericardium at precisely 30 degrees and aimed at the left shoulder, away from the coronary vessels. ECG guidance was ideal, but she didn't have the luxury of ideal. She had accuracy. She had 19 saves in a war zone. She had hands that had held people together when the only other option was letting them come apart. The Colonel's oxygen saturation dipped to 88. His heart rate climbed to 142, the desperate racing of a failing pump pushing harder and harder against pressure it could not overcome. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, the sound like something drowning in slow motion. She palpated landmarks, her fingers mapping the geography of his chest as precisely as radar reading a target. Xiphoid process. Right costal margin. The angle of approach. Prep the skin with chlorhexidine, watch it spread in concentric circles that caught the fluorescent overhead light like ripples in still water. The prep field glistened. Sterile drapes arranged in 4 corners. She was building a shrine to precision, one layer at a time. The needle entered clean. There was no resistance, no scrape of bone or cartilage, only the sensation of yielding tissue, of the needle sliding through the thin muscular wall of the pericardium like a key finding its lock. She felt it more than heard it, the slight change in resistance that told her she had entered the sac. The Colonel's heart was drowning in its own blood, filling the space meant for clean muscular contraction, and she was going to let it breathe. She aspirated. Pulled back on the plunger. The syringe filled with dark ruby blood, 200 milliliters of fluid that should never have existed in that space. One syringe, then another. The blood came out, and with it came the pressure that had been suffocating his heart. She watched the needle, kept it steady, kept it true. Pain was information. Every micro-adjustment of angle and depth told her she was exactly where she needed to be. 60 seconds. The systolic pressure read 76. Still dropping, but slower now. The trend was beginning to reverse. She aspirated another 30 milliliters. The syringe filled like evidence of her own competence, like proof that the last 15 years hadn't been forgotten, hadn't been buried beneath coffee service and humiliation and the weight of pretending to be smaller than she was. 90 seconds. The systolic pressure climbed to 95. His heart sounds cleared, the muffled, distant quality replaced by the crisp percussion of tissue contracting with actual force. The monitor's rhythm became less frantic, the rate settling from 142 to 118 to 104. The Colonel's chest rose with easier breaths, the ventilator's work becoming almost effortless by comparison. She withdrew the needle, applied pressure with sterile gauze, her movements the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She was documenting the procedure, her notes meticulous and complete, when the door opened. Dr. Whitfield entered with hospital security and the chief nursing officer trailing like storm clouds behind him. His face was white, but not with concern, with rage. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscles flexing beneath his skin. The security officer, an older man built like a former athlete gone soft, looked uncomfortable. The CNO looked trapped between professional duty and moral horror. "You just performed a surgical procedure without physician authorization," Whitfield said, and his voice was very quiet, which made it worse. Quiet rage was the kind that had already decided your fate. "You're done. Security escorts you out. Now." Rachel finished writing her final notation. Procedure stable. Vitals normalized. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She simply set down her pen, and that small action, that refusal to engage in his theater, seemed to infuriate him more. The walkout was long enough for the entire ER to see. Security had her locker emptied into a cardboard box before she reached the break room. Her badge was deactivated at the main desk. She watched the light die on the electronic lock, a physical severing of every place she had pretended to belong. Inside the box sat the photo of her son in his marine dress blues, the evidence bag containing the colonel's combat boots. She couldn't leave them, couldn't let them become lost in hospital inventory like countless other forgotten belongings. The chief nursing officer handed her a termination letter, her hand shaking slightly, and Rachel took it without looking at the words. The words didn't matter. The termination mattered. The destruction of the cover mattered. The fact that she had just violated 20 years of operational security mattered. She walked through the lobby carrying her box, past staff members who stopped mid-conversation to stare, past a young resident who looked up from his tablet with recognition beginning to dawn in his eyes. Nobody stopped her. Nobody called her back. The doors to the parking garage slid open with a hydraulic sigh, and she stepped into the concrete and exhaust-scented dimness like a woman walking beneath the surface of water. 2 hours later, she sat in her car in the deep section where nobody came, engine cold and dead, forehead pressed against the steering wheel. Her hands were clean, she had washed them in a bathroom she would never access again, watched the colonel's blood spiral down the drain, erased the evidence of everything she had just done. But her hands didn't feel clean. They felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone whose hidden life had finally broken through its careful seals. She couldn't move. The weight of every buried year was pressing down, compressing her spine, crushing her lungs. 20 years of being no one. 20 years of Rachel Torres erased, classified, struck from every record that mattered. 20 years of deferring to men like Dr. Whitfield, of accepting humiliation, of being called sweetheart and temp and lesser than, because walking away meant exposing everything, because staying hidden meant her son could live without knowing his mother had been ordered to disappear, without understanding that she had chosen duty over him. She didn't hear Dr. Whitfield in his office, already on his phone with the hospital board president at the country club, interrupting his golf game, his voice hot with fury as he described a nurse who had operated above her scope, who had endangered a patient, who needed to be reported to the state board immediately. She didn't know that he was already accessing Rachel's agency file, calling her references, demanding employment history and verification. She didn't know that he was bringing in an external medical review investigator by evening, that he was building a case file against her, that his rage had transformed into strategic retaliation with the precision of a man who understood exactly how to destroy someone using institutional mechanisms. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she had done the right thing, and it had cost her everything, and she had no way of knowing whether anyone would ever know that she had done it at all. The hospital lobby television flickered with the 6 o'clock news, and Rachel Torres stood near the elevators, her cardboard box of personal effects resting against her hip like a shield. The screen shifted to a Pentagon investigation segment, decorated veterans vanishing without records, and then her own face appeared, 20 years younger, dress blues crisp and uncreased, eyes carrying the weight of things she still couldn't speak about. The caption read, Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, combat medic, missing since 2004. Her jaw didn't move. Her hands didn't tremble. The box stayed exactly where it was. A young soldier visiting his brother in oncology stopped mid-stride near the pharmacy. His eyes locked on Rachel standing motionless by the elevator bank. He stared for 3 full seconds, then whispered it, not loudly enough to broadcast, but loud enough to carry, Reaper 6. That was her code name. That was who she'd been in Fallujah when she'd held 19 soldiers alive through the hours before medevac, when her hands had moved faster than shock, when pain was data and blood was information. The soldier's hands opened and closed at his sides, like he couldn't decide whether to approach or salute. The veteran security guard at the front desk, a former Marine with a scar that split his left eyebrow in half, stood up slowly. His uniform seemed to straighten itself. When he spoke, his voice carried through the lobby with the precision of a parade ground command Master Chief Petty Officer on deck. It wasn't loud, it was calm and final, the kind of statement that moved mountains. A nurse paused mid-stride. A radiologist looked up from his phone. An elderly woman in a wheelchair turned to see who was important enough for that voice, that tone, that absolute gravity. One by one, they stood. The veteran with the hip replacement who'd served in Desert Storm. The young woman who'd worked supply chain logistics for CENTCOM. A priest with Vietnam tattoos hidden under his collar. A respiratory therapist who'd done a tour with the 82nd Airborne. 12 veterans rose to their feet without speaking, and the lobby, the fluorescent hum, the beeping monitors from the trauma bay, the distant ring of phones, seemed to pause in acknowledgement. They didn't cheer. Heroes don't get applause in hospital lobbies. They get silence. They get standing. Rachel set the cardboard box down on a nearby chair and didn't move. The mask had cracked the moment that television screen showed her face, and she was watching it splinter in real time, and there was nothing left to hide behind now because the world had already seen her name. The general arrived 40 minutes later, a 2-star who moved like he'd spent his career in rooms where men died if you used the wrong word. He came with a folder the size of a small novel, and he asked to see the hospital administrator immediately, and his aide, a captain with the bearing of someone who'd defused actual bombs, carried a second set of documents with classified stamped across the seal in letters that caught the fluorescent light. The administrator's office on the 4th floor held 5 people, the general standing with parade ground posture, Dr. Whitfield against the far wall looking like his oxygen had been cut off, the administrator behind his own desk with the expression of a man watching his professional reputation collapse in slow motion, the hospital's chief nursing officer with her arms crossed, and a clinical documentation specialist who'd been brought in to audit Rachel's emergency procedure and had instead found something far worse in the comparative charts. The general opened the folder. His voice moved like a blade. Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres earned a Bronze Star in 2003 for coordinated casualty evacuation under sustained fire. He set the first document on the desk. The administrator nodded, saying nothing. Silver Star in 2004 for leadership during Operation Phantom Fury when she maintained medical stability for casualty patients simultaneously while managing incoming fire from 2 building lines. Another document. Whitfield's jaw clenched visibly. 2 Purple Hearts, one for shrapnel in 2002, one for a gunshot wound in 2004. The general looked up. Both wounds she treated herself because she couldn't leave her patients. The chief nursing officer's hand tightened into a fist. And a Navy Cross recommendation that was classified and buried in 2005, which means someone very high up decided her service was too sensitive to acknowledge publicly. The last document settled on the desk. That recommendation was written by Lieutenant Colonel James Hendricks, who is currently in your cardiac intensive care unit alive because of her. Whitfield started to speak. The general's eyes didn't even flick toward him. "You're going to be quiet now," the general said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, all mechanical precision, all patience, all the understanding that he could crush you and still be on schedule for lunch. The administrator pulled a second file across his desk. Dr. Whitfield, the external investigator, submitted preliminary findings an hour ago. The clinical documentation specialist stood, a woman in her 50s with the posture of someone who'd seen too many charts altered after the fact. She didn't need to read from her notes. 13 cases of undocumented complications in the past 18 months. for cases where treatment decisions contradicted contemporaneous assessments. 2 cases of post-dated chart modifications following adverse events. She let that sit. The Jameson case was particularly notable. Mr. Jameson presented with clinical indicators of sepsis at 0800 in the morning. Your notes state you ordered blood cultures at that time. Pharmacy records show the order wasn't placed until 14:30, 6 hours later. The patient coded at 1600. Those are standard clarifications. Whitfield's voice cracked like something breaking under pressure. The Kovac case, the chief nursing officer said quietly. Her voice held the weight of someone who'd written 3 complaints and watched them disappear. The Andrews case. The Chen case. 3 formal complaints from nursing staff in the past year, all withdrawn after you threatened their performance reviews. She looked directly at him. I was here when you told them that if they made a second complaint, you'd have them flagged as difficult employees and no hospital in Georgia would hire them. Whitfield stood, his hands curling into fists. This is retaliation because I enforced proper medical protocols against someone who was operating far outside her scope of. You reassigned her to prevent her from saving a patient's life, the general said. The words fell like stones into still water. You activated your professional network to destroy her career. You brought in an investigator as a weapon. That weapon is destroying you instead. He turned slightly toward the door. The man you tried to let die is about to walk into this room. Colonel Hendricks appeared in a wheelchair, his aide pushing with the precision of military bearing, and even in that chair with his color still recovering from near death, he carried the weight of someone who'd commanded hundreds of soldiers through Fallujah's worst hours. The general didn't need to make introductions. The colonel's presence was introduction enough. Master Chief Torres saved my life, Hendricks said, his voice still rough with medications and recovery. I had cardiac tamponade, that's fluid compressing my heart. 7 physicians walked away from the case citing liability. Dr. Whitfield refused to authorize the procedure. So she performed emergency pericardiocentesis with needle decompression while I was in critical distress. She had training in field medicine that exceeded everyone in this hospital combined. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that comes from 15 years of saving lives in combat. He gestured to his aide, who set down a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a pair of combat boots, worn and creased from years of field work, the leather cracked from desert heat and blood that had belonged to Captain Marcus Morrison, his predecessor, the officer Hendricks was describing. These boots are stained with the blood of a soldier Master Chief Torres carried for miles through active enemy engagement in Fallujah while coordinating air support and maintaining his airway with one hand and a radio in the other. She's had nothing, no recognition, no acknowledgement, no choice, because someone at the Pentagon decided she needed to disappear. And Dr. Whitfield, you tried to let me die rather than admit that a temp nurse was better at medicine than you've ever been. The room went silent. Not the polite silence of people waiting for their turn to speak. The heavy silence that comes when the architecture of someone's world reveals itself as cardboard and lies. 10 seconds passed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Nobody moved. The administrator stood slowly. His voice was carefully controlled, which somehow made it worse. Dr. Whitfield, your medical privileges at Seattle General are revoked effective immediately. You are suspended pending a full investigation by the State Medical Board. Security will escort you from the premises. He paused. I suggest you contact an attorney. Whitfield's mouth opened and closed. The network he'd spent 20 years building, the board connections, the professional relationships, the institutional leverage, had collapsed in the space of one meeting. 2 security officers appeared at the door, not from the administrator's call but from the colonel's aide, because when a general walks into a hospital with classified documents, the hospital already knows what's about to happen. 6 months later, Rachel Torres walked through Seattle General's emergency department in Atlanta wearing a white coat with Director of Emergency Medicine embroidered on the pocket. Her limp was less pronounced now because she'd stopped hiding it. Physical therapy 3 times a week. Permission to exist. The cardboard box had been unpacked into an office on the administrative wing, and on the wall hung her Master Chief rank insignia, framed, no longer concealed. The fluorescent lights buzzed the same frequency they always had, but they seemed brighter now, or maybe she was just looking at them differently. On her desk sat the pair of worn combat boots, Captain Morrison's boots. She'd arranged to return them to his family in a private ceremony, his mother's hands shaking as she held the leather and the history. "My son talked about you," his mother had said. He said Master Chief Torres was the person who taught him what courage looked like. Rachel had stood in that woman's kitchen in full uniform, the first time she'd worn it outside of classified spaces, and understood that the 20 years of hiding had never been about protection. They'd been about erasure. They'd been about pretending that one of the most accomplished combat medics the military had ever trained was nobody at all. Her own boots, polished to mirror shine, rested beneath her chair in the office. Not hidden. Not packed away. Just there, waiting. She ran a staff meeting where a new temp nurse asked a question about protocol, and Rachel listened with complete attention, answered thoroughly, and took time to remember what it felt like to be invisible. "What's your background?" the temp nurse asked nervously. Rachel smiled slightly. "Combat medicine." "Quite a bit of it." The nurse nodded like that explained everything and nothing, the way people usually do when they're standing in the presence of something larger than the moment can contain. Colonel Hendricks had returned to active duty, commanding a forward operations group at Fort Bragg. He'd sent Rachel a photograph of her son's unit in Kandahar province. She hadn't known they'd been photographed together, and a handwritten note that sat in a frame next to Captain Morrison's boots: "Your son served with honor. His unit has been trained by the best. That's you. Thank you for never stopping." Her son had been medically discharged 3 months later, a knee injury that had been getting worse since 2006. He was home now. He called his mother every Sunday. At Northside Community College, Dr. Whitfield taught CPR fundamentals to bored community college students who'd never heard of him, would never know his name had meant something once. His hourly rate was $14. His medical license was under formal review by the Georgia Board of Medicine. His network had quietly disconnected, every call to former colleagues went unreturned, every invitation revoked, every relationship that had been built on institutional power revealed as worthless the moment that power evaporated. He stood in front of a classroom of teenagers practicing chest compressions and watched one girl do the technique incorrectly and had no authority to correct anything anymore. Rachel's office phone rang with an incoming trauma alert: multi-vehicle collision, northbound on Interstate 75, 3 critical patients, all hands needed. She stood with economical movement, the kind of motion that comes from having trained every muscle to serve purpose, and headed toward the emergency department. A young resident saw her coming and stepped aside with visible respect, not the courtesy doctors show administrators, but the respect soldiers show combat medics. The kind of respect that's earned in moments when lives balance on the edge of a decision. She paused at the ambulance bay as the sirens grew louder, watching her team prepare for the incoming critical patients with the organized chaos of people who knew exactly what they were doing. The receiving nurse looked to her for signal. The trauma surgeon stood ready. The blood bank had already been alerted. Everything was in motion because she'd set it in motion, and nobody questioned that authority anymore because it was written in every decision she made, every command she gave, every life she'd already saved. She keyed her radio, her voice steady and clear: "This is Torres. Trauma team, report to Bay 3. We're receiving 3 critical patients, ETA 4 minutes. I want full monitoring, 2 large ball lines, typo uncrossed standing by." "Copy that, Director," the charge nurse responded. As the sirens wailed closer and the automatic doors of the ER hissed open to receive the incoming ambulances, Rachel thought about the difference between what you do when the world is watching and what you do when nobody sees. She'd spent 20 years in that second category. She'd saved 19 soldiers in the dark, carried them to helicopters in the dust, held them alive through the hours before medevac when nobody was keeping score and nobody would ever know their names. She'd done it because it was right. She'd done it because they deserved to live, and her hands were steady, and pain was information, and nothing else mattered. But sometimes the world needed to watch. Sometimes people needed to see what courage looked like when it walked into a room wearing scrubs and rank insignia that had finally come home. The first ambulance pulled into the bay. The sirens cut. The chaos organized itself into precision. Rachel Torres moved through it all like the apex predator of this particular domain, and for the first time in 20 years, she was exactly who she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was trained to do, in full view of everyone who needed to remember what a hero looks like. She keyed her radio one more time, trauma team standing by. And the work began. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments, have you ever had your moment to prove them wrong? We read every single comment, and your stories matter. Thanks for watching.